Hi everyone, this is our second lecture this week. We'll be talking about the theorists. Particularly, we will be talking about Comte, Martineau, Spencer, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Mead, and then finally Goffman. Our first sociological theorist was Auguste Comte. Comte is sometimes called the father of sociology. That's not entirely accurate. He did give us the term sociology, and he stated that this thing he called sociology was needed to, and it needed to be like any other scientific discipline. What he wanted to do is study society, study the things that happen in society in a way that was scientific. Great, good start. But what he actually wanted to do was to replace religion with this thing he called sociology, because he was a French revolutionary during the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, there were a lot of negative feelings about religion. And Comte recognized that religion was necessary to observe society and gave us some good things, but he also observed that, especially in that society, religion did a lot of bad things. So he said we should develop this thing called sociology, and this thing called sociology should help us observe society and understand what's going on. To put it very shortly, what Comte actually called sociology doesn't resemble what modern sociology looks like. Harriet Martineau was another sociologist that I wouldn't quite call a sociologist, but a pre-sociologist. She was a social activist who traveled the United States and wrote about social changes that were radical for her time. So she wanted to talk about the democracy, the Republican democracy that was occurring in the United States in the 1800s. And this was semi-unique for that world to see what Republican democracy would look like. And the people in Europe, they were saying, oh, what's happening in America is this amazing thing. And what's happening in America is changing in the world in this way and that way and this way and that way. But none of those people were actually observing what was happening because they were in Europe. What Martineau did was she came to the United States, she wrote down what she saw, she took that back to Europe. And that scientific observation is really Martineau's one of her major contributions. Another thing Martineau added was that she took Comte's work and translated them into English. Thus, people in the English-speaking world were able to take the thoughts of Comte, the Frenchman, and help us create this new discipline. Herbert Spencer was the first great English-speaking, I'll put sociologist in heavy quotes there, because he wasn't really, again, a sociologist. He was more of a scientist of all sorts. He studied biology, he studied physicists, he also studied what came to be sociology. Spencer believed, and he coined the term survival of the fittest. Now remember, the survival of the fittest is not Darwin's term. It actually is Spencer's term. And he believed that societies evolved through time by adapting to their changing environment. If you're familiar with the concepts related to Darwinian evolution through natural selection, that's not exactly what Darwin said, but this is how Spencer thought that societies developed. Now, it's important to note that certain groups in the early 20th century and even today also adhered to this idea of the survival of the fittest. And society, those who are in charge because they're the most powerful, they're the smartest, they're the best. Most notably among those groups in Germany in the 1920s through 40s were the Nazis. The Nazis very much took what Spencer said and they adhered it to their own ideology in a way that I'm sure Spencer wouldn't have appreciated. So Spencer is a very interesting character in what he laid down was probably not used in the way he wanted it to be. Durkheim. Emil Durkheim can easily be called the father of sociology. He worked to establish sociology as an important academic discipline, and in this, he was interested in how social factors bind and hold people together. So he was interested in how what he called social forces in our world bind people together. He studied the correlation between social isolation, what he would call anomie, and suicide. His hypothesis was that social isolation and not being connected to other people would lead someone to not only be lonely, but not feel accountable to others, and that would cause suicide. We see an illustration of this in 2009 National Health Statistics. You see areas of the United States in orange where there are lower population rates. There are actually higher suicide rates. On the converse, in California, on the far east coast, you see higher population rates. You also see lower rates of suicide. Additional concepts Durkheim gave us were the concept of anomie, that loneliness causing suicide, the concept of solidarity. Durkheim was interested in how we work together in society, how we pull together, how we feel like we're going to get through this together. That's what he called solidarity. There were two forms that he identified: mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is the type of solidarity experienced in societies where everyone does the same thing, everyone lives largely the same lives. We see this largely in agricultural societies. So if I'm a farmer, if I'm a Christian farmer and I have 4 children and I farm corn, then I know, and if everyone around me is a Christian farmer with 4 children that farms corn, then I know how to relate to everyone else because everyone else is just like me, and that's how my interconnectedness works. Organic solidarity is different. Organic solidarity is the type of solidarity we see in more advanced technical societies where everyone's job is a little bit different. So as a sociology professor, I can relate to somebody who works at the power company because I know I need them, because I know they're part of the greater organism that is society. Similarly, I need a butcher. I need someone that works at the gas station. I need someone that works on a road crew because they perform as important, maybe more important of a job as I do. And because we're all part of the greater organism, we get along. At least that's how Durkheim saw it. Durkheim also gave us the concepts of the sacred versus the profane. Durkheim was very interested, much like Comte, in how religion works. So he was interested in how certain material items became sacred, became spiritually special, and how other items are seen as being ordinary. Don't make the mistake of thinking profane means bad. In this context, profane means ordinary. So for example, many mainline Christian churches use bread, what is, materially bread, identical to other bread. Some churches, it would be acceptable to go to a Panera Bread, to buy a loaf of bread. Maybe the pastor would buy this loaf of bread, that at that moment on the shelf at Panera, all of the loaves of bread are identical. But when the pastor buys that loaf and takes it back to the church and performs the rituals on that bread, and then that bread is taken into the sacred space of the sanctuary, that bread, even if, regardless of your actual spiritual beliefs, all things aside, that bread becomes socially sacred. It becomes special to the people involved in those rituals, even if it's absolutely materially the same as the other bread. And Durkheim observed that difference in the way that people interact with the bread. And that's a socially sacred item. Structures. Durkheim identified that society has given structures that we discussed a little bit ago. Durkheim also laid the groundwork for the concept of the manifest function, the latent function, and the dysfunction. These are not actually Durkheim's concepts. They're a man named Robert Merton's concepts, but he laid the groundwork, so we'll talk about it here. This set of theories states that every structure in society has purposes, and those stated purposes are manifest functions, so they're the reason the thing exists. The manifest function of education is to teach you certain things, get you prepared for the workforce. The latent function of education may be to teach you how to be a certain level of tech savvy in our online class. To maybe you're not necessarily a high tech person for your job, but you still need to be tech savvy. That would be a latent function. It's an unintended positive function. And then a dysfunction. This would be something bad that the structure does. So the structure of education, in all likelihood, most of you will have a significant amount of debt by the time you are out of college. That is definitely a dysfunction and could be identified as such. Marx, second major thinker within sociology. Marx was a German philosopher and political activist. His thought significantly contributed to conflict theory. Marx himself was not a sociologist. The discipline of sociology really came together in the early 1900s. Marx died in the late 1800s, but his thinking and his writings were so influential that they came to form what is now known as conflict theory. Marx himself was greatly influential in politics, history, geography, the discipline of economics, and other disciplines. If you have studied any degree of political science or philosophy, you would probably recognize Marx as being tied with, what's called Marxist social thought, communist thought, socialist thought, these sorts of things. Marx believed that capitalism was creating social inequality between the bourgeoisie, which is the French word he used to mean the owning class, and the proletariat, who were the workers. According to Marx, this inequality between the rich and the poor would lead to class conflict, the haves and the have-nots. The rich getting rich, the poor getting poorer. There's all kinds of ways you could say it. And similarly, Marx gave us this concept of praxis, in which scholars should use their knowledge to contribute to social change. So Marx felt that the purpose of conducting scholarly research is to try to change the world. Additional concepts Marx gave us is he highlighted the existence of social inequality. Social inequality, the fact that some people have more money than other people, is obvious once it's pointed out, but it's not always something a lot of us think about. False consciousness and class consciousness are two other concepts that Marx gave us. So with class consciousness, Marx stated that in order for the working class to come together to overthrow their capitalist overlords, we would have to recognize what we have in common. So the miner would have to look at his fellow miner and recognize that they have things in common and they don't have things in common with the owners. Similarly, the miner would have to recognize that he has things in common with the fast food worker, the road worker, the nurse, all of these people that do not own the factories or whatever. And once they recognize that they have things in common, that state is called class consciousness. False consciousness, then, is the opposite state from class consciousness. False consciousness is the workers still identifying with their bosses, not necessarily their supervisors, but the people that own the places where they work. And Marx said that that has to be broken, that the person working at McDonald's shouldn't be identifying with the CEO of McDonald's, right? They should be identifying with their fellow workers. And once they overthrow that mode of thinking, then the Marxist revolution could happen. The dialectical model is another major contribution of Marx. If this were a philosophy class, we would go into greater detail on the dialectical model. What you need to know is that the dialectical model, or this thing called dialectical materialism, is a way of thinking that Marx was interested in. And what he did was he took physical, concrete, measurable things, namely usually money, and compared in our society what it means to have a lot of money versus what it means to have not so much money. And that's that's an incredibly simple way to put a lot of Marxist thought. Socialism and communism are other offspring of Marxist thought. Socialism, to be defined very simply, is the state ownership or control of the economy, and socialism is often mixed with other systems. There are socialist elements within our own economy. There are capitalist elements in Cuba's economy, and there were capitalist elements in the Soviet Union. We'll talk about that in greater detail when the course progresses. Similarly, communism, which is total state control of the economy and is often accompanied by severe dictatorships. Communism is another byproduct of Marx's thinking. And in all likelihood, just like Spencer did not like what the Nazis did with his thinking, Marx probably wouldn't have liked what people like Pol Pot and Kim Jong-il did with his thinking. Max Weber came after Marx in the conflict theorists line of social thought. Weber was interested in how society was becoming industrialized, and he's said to have spent much of his career arguing with Marx's ghost. What that means is Weber struggled with, keep in mind Weber did his work far after Marx's death. Weber struggled with how to make Marx's political philosophy into a viable social science. He acknowledged that there was a lot that could be done with Marx, but it, as it existed in its raw form, wasn't quite science. Additional concepts Weber pioneered were the concept of rationalization, which is applying economic logic to all human activity, and disenchantment, or the dehumanizing features of modern societies. Weber was also interested in the bureaucracy and another term called the iron cage. We'll talk about those as the course progresses. George Herbert Mead was an interactionist. He was interested in the connection between thought and action, between individuals and society. He wanted to know how our interactions with other people and how our interactions with society impacted the way we live, basically. Mead suggested that the meanings we give to objects in our society are social processes, and people interact, and meanings come from those interactions. So your shoes have meanings around them, whether they are relatively simple shoes, whether they are really fancy shoes. And how people react to those shoes aren't necessarily because of how they look like, but how we have interacted with shoes that have looked like that in the past, if that makes any sense. I'm sure it'll make more sense as the course goes on. Finally, Goffman was interested in how the self is developed through interactions with others in society. His big interests were stigma, presentation of self, and dramaturgical analysis. So Goffman was interested in how certain groups of people or certain people were identified as being worse or bad or undesirable. Why are criminals seen as being irredeemable? Why are people in certain minority groups seen as being stupider than other people? This is really an ugly phenomena. And again, that's not to say that Goffman thought it was a good phenomena. It was just something he thought was worthy of studying. Other concepts he studied, again, are presentation of self and dramaturgical analysis. And these bleed all into dramaturgy, which describes the way people strategically present themselves to others. Dramaturgy, drama being the key portion there, sees the world literally as a stage. So there are different social stages or social settings, and in each social stage or social setting, we are prompted with certain scripts. We have certain jobs to play. There are certain backstages to play where we get ready for our performance, those sorts of things. So there's Goffman. So this week, in our discussion boards, I want you to choose one theorist and tell us why you find that theorist very interesting. How do you think their ideas could be applied to understand our current society? So how can we take Goffman's thinking and apply it to the modern world? How can we take Marx's thinking and apply it to the modern world, etc.? Please note, though, if you do choose Spencer, I need you to address the problematic groups that used his ideas in the past. I just don't want you saying he was the greatest thinker without also acknowledging that other stuff. In quiz one is due this Wednesday. You have to make that by midnight. Similarly, your first post has to be made by midnight. The other posts be on midnight on Wednesday. The other posts can be made by midnight on Sunday, but by all means, do them earlier if you possibly can. Okay, that's it. Good luck.